Hey Combs, Darren here. We have our second case file for Now Case of the Mondays, episode 2. We're going to have a look at this week's words. Now that it's after midnight, this week's words will be... The first word is implicative. The second word is onside. And the third word is swindlery. Alright, we'll see you guys in a week. This week's word is swindlery. To swindle is to cheat out of money or other assets, to obtain by fraud or deceit. The very first actual recorded case of fraud was in 360 BC when Xenophamus and Hegestratus got together and devised a plan. They were hired to take a load of corn from Syracuse all the way to Athens. But the problem was that in those days, a lot of boats sunk and they took advantage of this uncertainty. The buyer would take on the full risk if the shipment didn't make it there. What they decided to do was, instead of putting corn in the ship, they left it completely empty. The plan was to sink the ship after a few days and escape in lifeboats. Unfortunately, the crew caught them trying to sabotage the ship, and they didn't take too kindly to Hegestratus trying to drown them for his own financial gain. They chased him around the ship, and eventually Hegestratus jumped overboard and drowned. Unable to sink the ship on his own, Xenophamus had to sail on to port, at which point the buyer asked him why there was no corn on the ship. Back in the Middle Ages, animals were worth a lot of money, especially pigs, and the way that they would sell them is they'd capture them in a bag. Now, if the buyer neglected to look inside the bag, sometimes they would insert a cat. And when the buyer finally got home and opened up the bag, to their dismay, they'd be out a pig. This original pig in a poke eventually became known as letting the cat out of the bag. In the late 1840s, there was a man by the name of William Thompson. What he would do is he would choose a target or a mark and gain their confidence. Once he did this, then he would ask to borrow a precious item for a day or two on the promise that he would return. After disappearing with their item, he broke their confidence, therefore known as the very first con man. Con men have figured out new and interesting ways to gain confidence in their audience throughout the ages. One of the most famous was the 3-card money. They would be told to watch the money card.
Listen carefully.
Just like in cards, fast hands and quick thinking are needed to pull off many of these con artists' heists. The thieves' harmless actions are to implicate to their marks that they're completely on side of the law.
Quiet your mind. It is time to be silent.
To these thieves, the creativity has now become an art form. The largest art heist in history occurred in 1990 when 2 men dressed as police officers approached the Gardner Museum in Boston. The police officers gained entry when they told the security guards that they were responding to a call. Once they were in, they handcuffed the security guards and placed them in the basement. They spent the next 81 minutes picking and choosing 12 valuable artworks worth over $300 million. The men are still at large, even though shortly after the authorities offered them a $2.6 million offer and complete immunity from any charges. Not only big artwork is worth a lot of money, but so is small artwork. The smallest artwork you could consider would be a stamp. The largest stamp that's ever been sold at auction went in 2010 in Geneva, Switzerland, sold for over $3.14 million. And if you're not lucky enough to come across any rare stamps, you could just commit some fraud with them. In 1919, there was an Italian businessman who realized that he could buy 1 cent worth of stamp in Spain, and for that he could exchange it for 6 cents worth of stamp in the United States, therefore creating profit. He was promising 50% returns in 45 days. Even when investors cashed out, he paid them their full return. However, his scheme was not as profitable as first mentioned. What he was actually doing was he was borrowing money from the new investors to pay whoever cashed out. This is the proverbial borrowing from Peter to pay Paul. When the Italian businessman's plan fell apart, he brought down with him 6 banks and over $20 million worth of investors' money. When Charles Ponzi was arrested, he faced life in jail. The largest Ponzi scheme in history was executed by Bernie Madoff, who made off in 2008 with over $65 billion of money from billionaires and celebrities alike, from the names of Zsa Zsa Gabor, Kevin Bacon, Steven Spielberg, just to name a few. Once he was caught, he was sentenced to 150 years in prison. In the early 1800s, mail was paid for by the recipient. If they were unable or unwilling to pay for it, there was a problem. This problem was solved in 1937 when a school teacher by the name of Rowland Hill invented the very first adhesive for the modern stamp. He was later knighted for this feat. Another person who was knighted was Sir Paul McCartney. He himself was involved in a swindle. Paul McCartney and Michael Jackson were really good friends. They worked on a few songs together. One day, Paul suggested to MJ that he should consider buying copyrights for songs. Michael Jackson said, "I'm gonna buy yours." In 1985, the Beatles songs came up for auction. Paul thought about bidding $10 million for it, but went way above that to almost $50 million to a lucky bidder. In 1925, Victor Lustig was reading a newspaper. Apparently, the Paris government was having problems with the upkeep of the Eiffel Tower. He devised a con where he posed as a government official, and he gathered 6 of the largest scrap metal dealers and told them about the government's secret plan to sell off the Eiffel Tower for scrap metal. And after accepting a rather large bid, he grabbed a suitcase, filled it full of money, and took the very next train to Vienna. When the scrap metal dealer realized that he had been duped, he was even too ashamed to report it to police. All swindlers have one thing in common, and that is to get something for nothing. But to feel real success, one has to understand the value of hard work and true dedication.